The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadowed streaks over the crumbling neighborhood. The streets were lined with graffiti-covered walls, broken windows, and abandoned storefronts, a stark contrast to the gleaming towers of the city's wealthier districts. The air smelled of exhaust, stale garbage, and wet concrete, and the distant hum of traffic barely managed to cover the noise of the neighborhood's decay. It was a place where hope had long since packed its bags and left. Life here wasn't easy, but even in the heart of the forgotten, there was always life, raw, real, and sometimes painful. And amidst it all, a boy ran through the streets, his bare feet slapping the cracked pavement as he moved with purpose. His name was Jaden, a 10-year-old black boy whose clothes, worn and frayed, hung loosely on his thin frame. His eyes, bright despite the dirt and exhaustion that clung to him, carried a quiet strength that no one could have predicted in a place like this. Jaden's life was defined by survival. He was homeless, living on the streets with no family to take him in. His days were spent scouring dumpsters for food, finding shelter wherever he could, and dodging the dangers that lurked around every corner. The world often forgot about kids like Jaden, the ones who didn't have a place to go, the ones who fell through the cracks. But Jaden had something that the world couldn't take from him: hope. In the face of everything life had thrown at him, he still had the capacity to believe in something better, something brighter than the life he was living. Today was no different. Jaden was on the move, hustling through the streets with the same determination that had carried him through the hardships of his young life. He didn't know where his next meal would come from, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to give up. As he turned a corner, he noticed a car, unlike any he had ever seen, pulled up in front of a nearby alley. It was sleek, black, and polished, the kind of car that didn't belong in a neighborhood like his. The low rumble of the engine cut through the usual city noise, and for a moment, Jaden couldn't help but stop and watch. The world of wealth and luxury felt like a different planet, something he could never touch. The car's door opened, and out stepped a woman, perfectly groomed and dressed in high-end clothes. She moved with an air of confidence, a stark contrast to the broken world around her. She was talking into her phone, completely distracted as she made her way toward a nearby store. Jaden's eyes flickered back to the car, and that's when he noticed it. Through the tinted windows, he saw the baby, a little girl, no older than a year, sitting alone in the back seat. Her eyes, wide and innocent, stared out at the world, her tiny fingers curled around the seatbelt, as if she were unsure of what was happening around her. The woman didn't see her. She was too focused on her phone, walking briskly toward the store. The car's door clicked shut automatically as she walked away, and the baby, vulnerable, alone, and unaware of the danger, was left behind. Jaden's heart skipped a beat. The baby's soft cries cut through the noise of the street, but the woman was already out of earshot, lost in the distractions of her life. Jaden hesitated for only a moment before he made up his mind. He ran toward the car, his small legs moving faster than he ever thought possible. The cries grew louder, more desperate, and Jaden could feel the urgency in his chest. He had seen this before. Abandoned children, lost in the chaos of the city, but this time, something inside him snapped. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. He reached the car, his breath heavy and ragged as he tried the door handle. His hands were shaking, sweat beading on his forehead as he pulled with all his strength. The door wouldn't budge. The baby's cries grew more frantic, and Jaden's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't wait for help. He couldn't leave her here. With a final, desperate tug, the door clicked open, and Jaden slid inside. The baby's wide eyes locked onto his, filled with fear, but trusting. Jaden carefully scooped her up, holding her small, fragile body against his chest. She was cold to the touch, and Jaden could feel the weight of her in his arms, but there was no time to waste. He glanced back over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching, but the street seemed strangely quiet, as if the chaos had paused for just a moment. He moved quickly, heading toward the alley where he could find a bit of shelter and safety, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he struggled to hold the baby and move swiftly through the streets. Jaden didn't know what he was doing or how things would turn out, but one thing was clear. He wasn't about to let this little girl be abandoned. Not on his watch. Jaden's eyes scanned the street, his mind consumed with the usual worries, where he might find his next meal, where he could sleep for the night, and how to survive another day. His small hands rifled through a trash can, searching for anything that might be of use when something caught his eye. It was a car, a shiny, luxurious vehicle, parked by the curb. It didn't belong in this part of the neighborhood. Its polished exterior was almost too bright against the grim backdrop of the alley. But what truly stopped Jaden in his tracks was what he saw inside the car. Through the tinted windows, he saw a baby, alone, trapped in the back seat of a locked car, completely vulnerable. The baby was crying, small sobs that grew louder with each passing second. Jaden's heart skipped a beat. He looked around. There was no one in sight. The street, typically filled with people, was now eerily quiet. The car sat there, abandoned, the child left to fend for herself. Without thinking, Jaden's instincts kicked in. The world around him seemed to vanish. The hunger, the exhaustion, the bitterness of his daily struggle, all of it faded. In that moment, there was only one thing that mattered: saving this baby. Jaden's breath hitched as he ran to the car, his mind racing. He tried the door handle, but it was locked. Panic set in for a moment, but it was fleeting. He was too determined. The child needed him, and he couldn't let her down. Without wasting another second, Jaden grabbed a nearby rock and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered, the loud crack echoing in the empty street. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't hesitate. He reached inside, pulled the baby out carefully, and cradled her in his arms. She was cold to the touch, her tiny body trembling, but her cries had subsided as soon as he held her. Jaden didn't stop to check if anyone was watching. He didn't care. His only focus was on getting the baby to safety. His legs burned with each step, but he kept moving, rushing down the street with the fragile life in his arms. The baby was so small, so innocent, and yet the weight of her life felt like a mountain in his arms. As he passed through the neighborhood, his face determined but his body shaking from both fear and adrenaline, the stares began. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers growing louder. A group of people from the nearby affluent neighborhood had gathered, their eyes widening in disbelief as they watched Jaden run by. Their stares, sharp and judgmental, bore down on him like a storm. A man in a suit, standing with a group of his colleagues, muttered loud enough for Jaden to hear, "What's that kid doing with the baby? Shouldn't he be back in his alley?" His voice dripped with disdain, a judgment that made Jaden's stomach twist. The woman standing next to him raised her eyebrows, clearly uncomfortable. "Does he even know how to take care of a baby?" she said, her voice soft but filled with suspicion. "Look at him. He's homeless." Jaden's steps faltered for a moment, but he didn't stop. The words stung, but they weren't enough to stop him. He could hear more murmurs, more voices questioning his right to be there, to hold the baby, to save her. "Is he even capable of caring for that baby?" another woman asked. Her eyes narrowed with judgment as she pulled out her phone, aiming it at Jaden as if he were some sort of spectacle. "Maybe he's just trying to steal the baby," a man in the crowd added, his tone harsh and accusing. The insults, the taunts, they kept coming. Each word felt like a dagger aimed directly at his heart. But Jaden didn't flinch. He kept moving, focused on the tiny life in his arms, whose well-being was far more important than the judgment of strangers. Despite the racist comments, the harsh whispers, and the insults thrown his way, Jaden never stopped. His arms ached, his body screamed in exhaustion, but his determination was stronger. He had done what no one else was willing to do, what no one else had the courage to do. And no one could take that away from him. His face was set, his jaw clenched as he ignored the crowd, ignoring the hate and suspicion. All that mattered was that the baby was safe. Everything else faded into the background. Moments later, Clara returned to the car, her high heels clicking sharply on the pavement. She was still absorbed in her phone, making plans for a meeting. But as she approached the car, her steps slowed. The car door was wide open, and her eyes darted to the back seat. It was empty. A wave of panic washed over her. She looked around quickly, her heart starting to race as she saw the vacant seat where her baby had been just moments ago. The anxiety in her chest grew as she scanned the street, and then, in the distance, she saw him. Jaden, the boy she had not even noticed before, holding her daughter, her baby, Emma, in his arms. "What are you doing with my daughter?" Clara shouted, her voice sharp with anger but also fear. Her feet carried her quickly toward them, and her eyes, frantic and wide, locked onto Jaden. The crowd around her began to buzz with confusion, their eyes shifting between Jaden and Clara. Whispers spread like wildfire, growing louder as people watched the unfolding scene. Clara's voice broke through the murmurs. "What's going on here? Is this kid trying to steal my baby?" Several onlookers, their faces twisted in suspicion, muttered loudly amongst themselves. "He's a kid from the streets. What's he doing with that baby?" one man said, his eyes narrowed in judgment. "He probably just wants to make a scene," another woman added, a voice filled with doubt. "You can't trust people like him." As the whispers grew, the accusations against Jaden escalated, and some people even started filming, their phones raised as though Jaden's every move were part of some grand spectacle. "He's probably just trying to kidnap her," one person murmured, as if this assumption was fact. Jaden, despite the growing storm around him, remained calm, his face filled with an exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. His eyes never left the baby, Emma in his arms, his body shaking slightly but his hold protective. He didn't look at the crowd, nor did he respond to their accusations. He wasn't here to explain himself. He was here to keep Emma safe. Clara's anger began to fade as she looked at Jaden. For the first time, she really saw him. The way he was holding Emma, gently, his arms tight around her small form, made Clara pause. She could see the protectiveness in his posture. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He wasn't some criminal. He was just a kid, and somehow he had saved her daughter. Clara's expression softened, her hands shaking as she approached him. She knelt down to Jaden's level, her voice no longer filled with fury but with genuine concern. "How did you find my baby?" she asked quietly, her gaze flicking between Jaden and the baby in his arms. "How did you know she needed help?" Jaden looked down at Emma, still cradling her close to his chest. His voice was soft, steady, despite everything he had just been through. "I saw her alone in the car. She was crying, and no one else was around," he explained simply, his eyes filled with the same quiet strength that had driven him to act. "I knew I had to help. I couldn't leave her there." Clara's eyes filled with tears as the weight of the moment hit her. She had been ready to accuse him, ready to see him as the problem when, in reality, he was the solution. The realization crashed over her, and she swallowed hard before speaking again. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry for doubting you. You're the one who saved her, and I was ready to accuse you." As she spoke, the crowd's murmurs began to die down. The judgment in their eyes shifted, as they too saw Jaden differently. The whispers faltered as some began to lower their phones, their faces now marked with discomfort. Clara's apology hung in the air, and the realization began to settle in. Jaden wasn't the villain they thought he was. He was the hero. The crowd, once eager to judge, now shifted uncomfortably. Some of the onlookers avoided eye contact, their phones lowered as the weight of their assumptions became too much to bear. For the first time, Jaden saw the shift, the recognition of the truth. Clara reached out, her hand trembling as she touched Jaden's shoulder gently. "You've given me back my daughter. I owe you everything." Jaden, still holding Emma in his arms, nodded slowly, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. He had done what needed to be done. And now, finally, he was being seen for what he truly was, not just a homeless kid, but a hero who had saved a life. Clara stood in front of Jaden, her eyes filled with gratitude as she gently cradled her daughter in her arms. Emma, now safe, rested against her, still shaken but alive. Clara could hardly comprehend the depth of Jaden's kindness. How this boy, who had nothing, had risked everything for her daughter. She couldn't stop thinking about the way she had almost accused him, not seeing the hero right in front of her. Her chest tightened as the weight of the moment settled in. Without saying a word, Clara pulled out her phone and dialed her husband's number, her voice trembling as she spoke. "John, you won't believe what just happened. A young boy saved Emma. He's the one who pulled her out of that car when she was trapped. He's homeless, but his heart, it's enormous. He risked everything to save her." As she spoke, she looked at Jaden, her gaze softening further. "You're not just a hero," she said, her voice low but sincere. "You've shown me that kindness doesn't come from wealth. It comes from the heart." The words lingered in the air as Clara ended the call. She paused, her hand still holding her phone, and turned her attention to her purse. From it, she took out a checkbook, her movements deliberate. As she looked at Jaden, she felt a deep sense of responsibility. She could offer him a chance that had never been presented to him, and one he truly deserved. Clara took the pen and wrote something on the check. She held it out to Jaden, her eyes shining with emotion. "I want to help you," she said, her voice thick with sincerity. "This is for your schooling, for a better future. Whatever you need, I'll do everything I can to help you and your family." Jaden's hands trembled as he took the check, his mouth dry, his heart racing. This moment was everything he had ever dreamed of. A chance to change his life, a chance to escape the cycle of poverty he had lived in for so long. His mind struggled to process the enormity of it, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was about to be different. As Clara handed Jaden the check, the crowd of onlookers, who had once been so quick to judge him, fell silent. The accusations, the whispers, the doubt, all of it dissipated in the face of Clara's words. The truth had come to light. Jaden wasn't just a boy from the streets. He was a hero. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as they processed their own shame. The people who had once doubted Jaden's intentions were now facing the harsh reality of their prejudice. One woman, who had earlier whispered judgmental remarks, stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have assumed." Others murmured their apologies as well, their voices filled with regret. The phones that had once been raised in accusation were now lowered, as if the cameras no longer mattered. What mattered was the truth, the undeniable fact that Jaden had saved Emma's life, not for recognition, but simply because he cared. Clara looked at Jaden one last time before turning to leave with Emma. As she walked away, she turned back to him and said, "You've changed everything, Jaden. Don't ever forget that." Her words rang in the air, a reminder of the power of kindness and selflessness. Jaden stood in the middle of the street, the weight of the check in his hand, but even heavier was the weight of the opportunity that now lay before him. His heart raced, a mixture of excitement and disbelief. For the first time in a long time he felt hope stirring in his chest. His future, once uncertain and bleak, now seemed full of possibilities. As he looked around, he saw the people who had once judged him now looking at him differently. The crowd that had once filled the air with doubt and suspicion was now silent, their gaze full of something else. Respect. Jaden's eyes shifted to the sky, the promise of a brighter future before him. For the first time in his life, he could see a way out, a chance to rise above the circumstances he had been born into. And for the first time, he believed that anything was possible. Months passed, and Jaden's life was beginning to look completely different. The streets that once felt like the only home he would ever know now seemed like a distant memory. He had traded in the uncertainty of survival for the promise of a future. Thanks to Clara's generosity, Jaden was now enrolled in one of the most prestigious schools in the city. His days were no longer spent searching for food or dodging danger in the alleys. They were filled with textbooks, lessons, and the excitement of learning. Jaden sat at his desk in a brightly lit classroom, his head bent over a math problem. His pencil moved quickly across the paper, his mind working in ways it had never been allowed to before. He had always been sharp, but now he had the tools to apply his intelligence. His classmates, who at first had looked at him with curiosity, now recognized him for his brilliance and determination. He was no longer the poor, homeless kid. He was Jaden, a young man with a future. The classroom was a stark contrast to the streets where Jaden had once spent his days. The walls were adorned with colorful posters, and the air smelled faintly of fresh paper and pencils. The hum of the school, once intimidating, now felt like the sound of opportunity. One afternoon, Clara visited the school, as she promised she would. She walked into the classroom with a smile that matched the warmth in her heart. The teacher, who knew Clara's story, smiled as Jaden stood to greet her, and the other students watched with curiosity. Clara's eyes shone with pride as she looked at Jaden, who was quickly becoming a symbol of success against all odds. "How are you doing, Jaden?" Clara asked, her voice filled with encouragement. "I'm doing great, Mrs. Davis," Jaden replied, his voice steady, filled with a quiet confidence. "I'm learning a lot. Thank you for everything." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She had seen Jaden's growth over the past few months, not just academically, but as a person. The boy who had once been invisible to society was now thriving. The wealth and status Clara had always known were nothing compared to the joy of knowing that Jaden was now on a path to greatness. Over time, Jaden's bond with Clara grew stronger. He didn't see her as just the woman who had given him a chance. He saw her as a friend, a mentor, and a second chance at life. Clara had offered more than financial help. She had given him something priceless, belief in himself. And through that belief, Jaden began to truly see his own worth. As Jaden walked through the school halls, he could hear the whispers of admiration from the other students. The same wealthy classmates who had once looked at him with suspicion now admired him for his strength, his heart, and his resilience. They saw past his skin color, past the struggles of his past, and saw a young man with the potential to do great things. Jaden's story began to spread beyond the school walls. His story was told in newspapers, on social media, and in local communities. People who once doubted him were now inspired by his bravery and determination. The crowd that had once accused him of being a threat now looked up to him. His act of kindness, his selflessness in saving Emma's life, had sparked a ripple effect. People began to look beyond race, beyond assumptions, and see the true worth of a person. Jaden, though still adjusting to his new life, was no longer just a homeless boy. He was someone who had proven that with courage and kindness, even the most impossible obstacles could be overcome. His future was no longer uncertain. It was full of promise. As he sat in his classroom, Clara's words echoed in his mind. Kindness doesn't come from wealth. It comes from the heart. Jaden smiled quietly to himself, knowing that he had done more than change his life. He had changed the way others saw the world. And with that, Jaden's new beginning had truly started.